Amen. Well, good morning. I am very impressed that you've lasted this long on the first Sunday with the broken AC. It's just what happens. We're a real New Testament church this morning. And for the few of you that are wondering, hey, those fans up on the ceiling, why are they not on? That's because those take heat that is up in the high thing and bring it down here. Trust me, you don't want that. Well, happy 4th of July holiday weekend. A lot of people traveling. It's kind of what we do. We're doing the cookout out there. Well, we've been in this summer series we've been calling 7 Deadly Sins of the Digital Age. We've been in this for a while. We've been looking at that list that so many people are familiar with of the 7 deadly sins, and we've been kind of pairing it up with a social media platform or an online network just for fun, just for conversation starters. And we're doing that each week. But the idea, of course, is to be able to look at each sinful tendency and be willing to address that in our own lives. Okay? That's the whole idea. Well, this morning, maybe for you, maybe this can be the week that you breathe a big sigh of relief in our 7 deadly sins list. This morning won't be the message where you're reaching into your deepest, darkest secrets that no one else can see. It's not one of those kind of messages. It's not one of those kind of sins. However, it's not because today's topic is any less severe. It's actually not because today's topic is any less applicable to each and every one of us. It's really nothing to feel relief about at all. It's simply the reality that today's sin is one that robs and ravages each and every single one of us in a very visible and ugly way. It's called wrath. And today we're going to use the social networking platform of Twitter to help us start talking about wrath, about rage, about anger. Twitter came out just a year or two after Facebook. Today it's more or less an online news and social networking service where users post and interact with each other with messages called tweets. Started off as a limited number of characters, 140 characters, very short blurb of text. Usage of Twitter spikes during prominent events, celebrity events, news events, world events, whatever it is. And most businesses, celebrities of all sorts, politicians, they all have Twitter profiles. And so you get this kind of thinning of the veil where celebrities and news anchors and politicians can just throw out and communicate on the spur of the moment, and everyday people like you and I can interact with the postings that they've put up. That's kind of the uniqueness of Twitter. Now, Twitter, especially in the last few years, has become the primary repository for internet outrage. People chime in and interact with some of the most hateful, vengeful, toxic language that you can imagine. And similarly, also as you might imagine, those threads of replies are like the train wreck that you can't look away from. So they gain staggering amounts of views and shares and are seen by millions of eyes, making our world appear as though we are a human race of delicate time bombs ready to explode and inflict danger at the slightest trigger. Survey by KRC Research found that 70% of 1,000 people surveyed think that online hostility has risen to crisis levels. 34% of those participants blamed Twitter specifically. And so this research firm studied the traction and the reach of the tweets, the messages. Tweets expressing anger and outrage were by far the most successful and reached the most users. Of course, meaning that they would be most responded to and interacted with, the self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's do this. Let's step aside and let's explore some things that maybe set us off in 2019 America, that send us plummeting into the world of outrage. We'll call them wrath triggers this morning. Let's take a look at a few pictures. How about this one? That's always infuriating, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure there's some law of physics at play there, but why can't it just pour into the glass? Well, what about this one right here? You ever seen that? I think I'm going to get these steaks. I'll just chuck them in with the chips on my way past. I don't need that. Now, if you're a neat freak or an OCD person, these next few might be right up your alley. Like, how about this one right here? Yeah, there we go. There were times I couldn't even walk in my kids' bathroom in their younger years, I'm telling you. And then you have stuff like this. I mean, did it take that much more effort to just set it down even with the lines? I mean, how do you walk away from something like that? And then, of course, this. Oh, boy, does that get on my nerves. First thing in the morning, I'm looking forward to my coffee, and there's a recipe for wrath right there. Right there. What about this one? I'm looking forward to seeing my daughter's dance recital, and oh, good, I get to watch it through your iPad screen. Isn't that nice? Now, you've probably heard me rant about this one before, but why does this even happen? Okay? It's a very thin, frail paper. There's a clear perforation. Why does that happen? All right, moving on. Well, here's its cousin, though. Have you ever done this in a public restroom? Yeah, right. Well, that's bad for you, but what about for the next person? How are they going to get anything out of there? Once again, hands on the pants, every time, every time. Now, here comes a two-parter, this next one. Driving down, looking for a parking space. Oh, there's a great one right there. Let's pull in. And then you see this. Oh, it's a smart car. All 2 feet of it, pulled all the... I mean, is there something different we could do? Maybe smart cars could take up like 2 in a space, or you can chain them to a bike rack or something. Now, here's the last one. This is pretty universal. Okay, 10 items or less. Most of us have some grace with 11 items, but this, come on. There needs to be something done about this, right? You see that and you just start boiling over. Now, maybe some of these things actually take you to dark places of sin with your anger, not sure. But for most of us, that stuff's on the lighthearted side, right? What if instead of those pictures, what if instead we put up pictures of Obama or Trump or immigrant detention centers, or started talking about gun control legislation or police shootings or celebrities not standing for the national anthem, or you fill in the blank? Some of you are already getting yourselves worked up just hearing them mentioned. So everyone listen, pause, breathe. Can't breathe too deep because the air is really thin in here this morning. But I'm going to ask you a very serious question, okay? Not a joke. Church, what do you want, and I mean really, what do you really want your passion and voice, your life investment here on earth, to be most outspoken about, to be known for, to be proclaiming the loudest? Do you want it to be your politics or your Jesus? Now, I'm not saying you can't have strong convictions about political and social issues. Don't hear me wrong. But I'm asking you, what do you want to speak the loudest? In some ways, I'm essentially asking you the question that has thread us through this series. Where have you put your hope and your anchor? As we move through the message this morning, I want to encourage you to keep cycling back to that question, to keep asking yourself that question, because I think political and social issues like these are our modern society's hotbed of outrage and divisiveness and hatred that are tearing down the witness and credibility of Jesus Christ and His church. It's a real issue, folks. But more often when we think of those things that get us worked up day to day, beyond that, it sounds something like this. I'm upset because that person holds an opinion contrary to the one I feel strongly about. That person did something I don't like, that offends me, that frustrates me, that inconveniences me. Did it ever occur to any of us that we all do things that others don't like and that inconvenience others? Every time I do something purely for my own comfort and my benefit and my convenience, the chances are very good it will be at the expense of someone else in some way. Everyone can't have all of their ideal wants and needs met all of the time. And yet, we rage and fight and spit as if we're all entitled to that somehow. Since when did we come to interpret life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as I should never have to be annoyed or inconvenienced or denied enjoyment? 99% of the time, our outrage is not over things that would ever make Jesus angry. Have you ever thought about that? And then in a twist of sick irony, the things that we do have record of Jesus getting angry about, they often don't always make us angry. I think we have some work to do, church. I do. Now listen, I'm no different than many of you. I have things that set me off that should not set me off. Sometimes I can have a surprisingly level head and a long fuse with people in certain situations. But other times, I disgust myself with how quickly I can get bent out of shape or so upset over something I know I shouldn't. So many of us get prickly about things that are so insignificant. I mean, think about, what was the last time you got really fired up? What was it about? Maybe it was something serious, but chances are pretty good it was something like losing a computer file, or your spouse burning one side of your grilled cheese sandwich, or the cat peeing in your shoe, the lady who cut in front of you at the grocery line, the restaurant server who gets your order wrong, the school soccer coach who didn't give little Johnny the position he wanted, the pastor who talks too fast, or the worship team that doesn't play songs you like. People, if we can't even get out of our own way to be able to cope with these microscopic infractions, how on earth can we be equipped to navigate the actual sufferings and challenges of life in a way that reflects Jesus Christ? Let's face it, our culture, our world is a festival of wrath. And so, as Karen Carpenter so eloquently put it years ago, we go on hurting each other. So what about Jesus? If we're trying to point people to Jesus, what about him? I want to be able to center the rest of our message here this morning on Jesus, and through a few key questions, discover some ways that we can be on our guard against the sin of wrath. And what I think we're going to find is the sin of wrath has a distinction from simply feeling anger. And within that distinction is what makes it such a destructive sin. You see, the sin of wrath is the anger that is vengeful, that is self-anchored, that is anti-love in essence. In fact, the sin of wrath was described as the following. This is an old, kind of ancient language, high church creed in talking about the 7 deadly sins. It said this: wrath is manifested in the individual who spurns love and opts instead for fury. Now, to spurn means to kind of forcefully push away. But maybe the most important word in that definition is opt. The individual who opts instead for fury. The idea of a choice. It's the modern day thinking that would say no person or group of persons and no one thing makes you angry. You decide to use anger as a response. Or as another source on the ancient sacred development of the 7 deadly sins over the centuries explains it this way. I think this one works well for our definition this morning. It says that wrath can be described as an excessive, misdirected, or uncontrolled feelings of anger, rage, and hatred. Dante, ancient writer, Dante described wrath as love of justice perverted for self, spite, and revenge. The wrathful people in his purgatory suffering were perpetually enveloped in blinding smoke that burnt their eyes and clouded their vision. Sometimes that's us. Our anger and our self-importance burn our eyes and cloud our vision. I remember the year after I graduated high school, there was that car I showed you a few weeks back, that big red classic car. I drove that around. I had been out late, and it was maybe 12:30, 1 a.m. I had just filled up at a gas station. At this point, I was wearing an army jacket. I had a big cactus spike mohawk. But I happened to be someone, and I went to a Mennonite church at that point, not kidding. I prided myself to a degree in being someone who looked as though they were rough around the edges, but was very kind and polite and compassionate, and I liked that kind of a contrast. Well, I filled up with gas, and apparently there was a police officer in a bank parking lot across the way. Paid for the gas, got in the car, started to drive away. As soon as I pulled out of the gas station, his lights went on. He pulled me over at the side of the road. He asked for my license, registration, and then he said, "I have reasonable cause to believe there's drugs or alcohol in this vehicle. Get out of the car." At this point, I'm getting pretty scared. It's like, "Officer, I don't do any of those things, but you're welcome to look." Me saying that got him really upset. Maybe he wanted an attitude, I don't know. He frisked me up pretty good, didn't find anything. He whipped me around and shoved me face down into the roof of my car, bloodied my nose, went up the back, threw me aside, looked through the car, had me open the trunk, getting angrier as he went because he wasn't finding anything. I'm trembling. I'm like, this guy has a nightstick and a gun on him. I don't know what he could do. He could do whatever he wants, and he's angry. It finally ended with him grabbing me and saying, "Watch yourself, punk," and throwing me back against my car. That was frightening. That's someone with smoke that is clouding and burning their eyes, obscuring their vision because they're so angry. Mark Twain said, "Anger is an acid that does more harm to the vessel in which it's stored than to anything on which it is poured." Aristotle said, "Anyone can become angry, that is easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, this is not easy." No kidding. A business leader who had been in management for years and ended up undergoing anger management training had this observation. He said, "I've learned that yelling at your staff doesn't make them work harder or smarter or better. It just makes them dislike working with you." And Jesus said this, "Whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." So now with an adequate definition and an explanation, what about Jesus? Let's dive into those three key questions, and through answering them, shed light on how we can guard against wrath. First of all, did Jesus get angry? Yes, emphatically yes, in fact. It's clearly depicted in the Bible in at least 3 occasions where it's very clearly laid out. The first time we read about it is in Mark chapter 3. Jesus is in a synagogue on the Sabbath. This guy has a withered hand, and he comes to Jesus to be healed. Now, the legalistic, self-important, self-righteous religious guys, the Pharisees, teachers of the law, they're there, and they're always trying to pin Jesus back against the wall. And they think they've got him this time, because you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And if he heals this guy's hand on a Sabbath, they can tell him he worked on the Sabbath and violated a commandment. If he doesn't heal this guy, they can say that he's heartless. He doesn't love people like he says he does. So they think they have him. And Jesus gets indignant, very angry with them, because they're valuing invented rules over someone's life and over their ability to interact with Jesus. Mark 3:5 says, "He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts." Another time we read, he was with his disciples. He had already been getting on them for being self-focused and self-important. You might remember the scene where they're arguing with each other about who's the greatest. He'd taught them about how it was so important to not stand in the way of what he called little ones. The language would suggest he was referring both to actual little children and to those who were young, curious, and exploring in their faith. He had just recently talked to them about that, and now he's speaking to a crowd. And families are bringing their kids to Jesus, and the disciples start yelling at the kids, "Don't bother Jesus. He's an important man. He's got stuff to do." And we're told in Mark 10:14, when Jesus saw this, he was indignant. That word indignant, when we see that, it most often is translated as really angry and forceful. Okay? Another instance we read, this time is probably the best known. This is John chapter 2. It's around Passover time, the time of year where there would be the biggest influx of people coming to worship at the temple. And Jesus gets there and he finds it to be a huge commercialized racket. All sorts of kinds of shady ways of basically turning the occasion of a sacred holy day into a cash cow, converting currency and selling religious trinkets. Now, if you ever need cold, hard proof that Jesus got angry, here's what goes down when he arrives and sees this. He makes a whip out of cords. The King James Version called it a scourge, which would have been very similar to the type of mutilation whip used to tear up the skin on Jesus' back before he was crucified. He makes one of those, and he charges into the temple courts, driving out the marketers and the money changers and flipping over tables. Look at John 2, verses 15 and 16. "So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, 'Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?'" And so Jesus, one man with a heart that burned for God and a mutilation whip, got passionate and angry enough to cause a huge setup of profiteering and commercial interests go running hightailed out of the temple area. So why does he do that? Why does Jesus get angry in these kinds of ways? It's because Jesus is serious about people being able to know and encounter him, to meet him, and he gets angry when things or people stand in the way of that. That's what Jesus wants his life, his passion, his voice to say and speak the loudest. So yes, Jesus got angry, but no, he never sinned, which is the distinction that we need to digest this morning. It's why one of the 7 deadly sins isn't simply anger. It's wrath, as we defined earlier, a certain type or manifestation of anger that is deeply destructive to our souls and to others, that is self-anchored. And Jesus' anger was never that. So that begs the next question. Well, then what is it specifically that got Jesus angry? Well, what if we made an imaginary list? A list of the things that made Jesus the most angry based on how often he spoke about them and the energy and the passion he put into talking about them. That list might look something like this: materialism, greed, selfishness, self-righteousness, hypocrisy, deception, insincerity, taking advantage of people, especially in God's name. But maybe at the top of the list is what we just said: things standing in the way of people encountering him. That's why he got so mad at the Pharisees' self-righteousness. It was standing in the way. Just like the profiteers turning his father's house into a festival to sell paraphernalia, his own followers rebuking kids trying to come to him, they were standing in the way. Now, I do want to use this to make an important clarification, okay? There, of course, are things worth getting our ire up about. Things that made Jesus angry, things that no doubt anger the heart of God. And some of those things most of us don't have to be told to get angry about. Things like child abuse and domestic abuse and drug abuse, rape and murder. Things like oppression of the weak and exploitation of the poor, ignoring the disadvantage of the marginalized. Except in some of those later phrases, that begins to get gray for some of us. But regarding Jesus, we're told in John 2:17, "Zeal for your house consumes me." That's how the disciples defined and observed about Jesus. Jesus was passionate about the things of God, and for Jesus that included getting angry about the smug self-righteousness of the Pharisees, about the exploitation of God's name going on at the temple. All of that stuff, that's what got Jesus worked up. So what about us? For me, it makes me painfully aware that I am a far cry from Jesus' godly zeal. Every time I lash out at one of my kids for spilling their drink, every time I justify overly critical words to someone by calling it concern, every time I feel the need to loudly clarify and defend myself against a perceived misunderstanding, even the times I think my disgust or my anger is appropriate because it's directed at myself. You know, maybe you're that kind of person, you crucify yourself and you think it's okay because it's at yourself. It can be just as damaging. But with all of these petty, self-grounded manifestations of anger, every time those gears grind, I realize how imperfect and weak I am. And so that walks us up on the door of our last question about Jesus this morning, of things we can work on in our own lives. And that's this: what does Jesus' life show us about handling anger? This is kind of where we get into it, all right? What can we learn from how Jesus handled his anger? The central truth behind that is just this: the problem we need to deal with is the kind of anger, the kind of wrath we are most accustomed to is too often not Jesus' kind of anger. Jesus universally has a heart for people. He loves them, which is why his anger wasn't sinful. It never acted contrary to his love for people. Whereas it's said that the sin of wrath in us is the sin most likely to harm other people. So here's the bottom line, church. We have got to learn some godly discipline in handling anger, in guarding against the sin of wrath that destroys. Just like it says in James 1:19 and 20. My dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. For man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. But that's the kind of anger we're used to, isn't it? Man's anger. Selfish anger. Anger because we don't like what we're experiencing. Anger because we're annoyed, uncomfortable, frustrated, inconvenienced, misunderstood, embarrassed, or any other real or perceived grievance against the Almighty Self. Maybe that explains why that imaginary list of what Jesus spoke out of the most that we came up with looks so different from our lists. So I want to leave us with this, with some very straightforward characteristics of Jesus' anger that I believe can go a long way towards helping us guard against the sin of wrath, okay? Help our hearts beat with God's. Traits that characterize Jesus' anger. Number one, right motivation. Right motivation. In other words, he was angry for the right reason. Jesus' anger did not arise from petty arguments or personal slights against him. There was no selfishness involved. Right motivation. Add to that right focus. That's the second one, right focus. Jesus was not angry at the weaknesses of others. His anger targeted true sinful behavior and true injustice. Again, no selfishness involved. Right motivation, right focus. Third one, right accompaniment. Mark 3:5 says that his anger was attended by grief over the Pharisees' lack of faith. That tells us that Jesus' anger stemmed from love for the Pharisees' souls, passionate concern for their spiritual state. It had nothing to do with hatred or disgust or ill will. Right accompaniment. Fourth one, right control. Jesus was never out of control, even in his anger. He controlled his emotions. He was balanced. He was measured. His emotions did not control him. Think of when he went and he made the whip out of cords. That wasn't an instantaneous process. He would have had to sit down and put that thing together. Gather his thoughts, perhaps. I don't know. So right motivation, right focus, right accompaniment, right control. Here's the last one. Right duration. He didn't allow his anger to turn into bitterness. He didn't hold grudges. He dealt with each situation properly, and he handled anger in good time. And as a result of those five, here's the last one, and that is right results. Because of those five, Jesus' anger had the unavoidable consequence of godly action. Jesus' anger, just like all his emotions, was held in check by the truth of the Word of God. And so his response would always accomplish God's will. You know what the contrary virtue is to wrath? Patience. Specifically, patience with people. The Old English used the word long-suffering. One word. And contained in the original language of that word was basically, love suffers long for people. It's a very rich word. I'm a word guy, so I like that kind of stuff. And it's a discipline. It involves a heavy dose of that pesky phrase that has come up a lot in this series, self-control. It doesn't come naturally, does it? Right? It's a discipline. It's a choice. But it's a choice that starves the ravenous appetite of this one of the seven deadly sins. Proverbs 15:1 says, a mild answer calms wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. It's why when you respond to anger with more anger, it stirs it up and it cycles it higher and higher. A mild answer calms wrath. That's how we can begin to control and starve wrath. It's patience, it's kindness, it's grace. Those are the things that prompt change, no doubt. Not vengefulness and wrath. That's not what creates change. Not only that, but patience and kindness, they draw us together as we seek to get near to God. Look at this great passage. This is from the Message transliteration of the Bible, from James 3:17 and 18. It reads, real wisdom, God's wisdom, begins with a holy life and is characterized by getting along with others. It is gentle and reasonable, overflowing with mercy and blessings, not hot one day and cold the next, not two-faced. You can develop a healthy, robust community that lives right with God and enjoy its results only if you do the hard work of getting along with each other, treating each other with dignity and honor. Hard work indeed. You see, anger always dissipates eventually. Our job is to work at it to let that dissipation happen sooner, by not holding on to it, by refusing to enjoy it. Yes, I said that. We enjoy our anger, don't we? Think about it. You find it's true. We might feel terrible later, but in the moment, we enjoy the power and the adrenaline, the high of the anger while we are giving ourselves into it. And in the process, we forget all the bad things about ourselves. That's what it does. Every angry person feels righteous in that moment. When we're angry, we choose to be consumed on the object of the anger, and we forget everything else. It's Judgment Day, and we want to play God. That's why it's so important for us to always remember that we're imperfect people. Our ideals are not always God's. We must remember this. A good deal of self-examination is required here. Why am I really angry? Is God angry about this? That's a question I try to ask myself. And usually the answer to that question doesn't give me more reason to be angry. Is God angry about this? That might be the most helpful idea in dealing with anger, is asking yourself that question. And in order to answer that question honestly, we had better know God very well, right? Because otherwise we might just make him into our own image. In order to know if God would be angry about something, you need to know God well. But let me take that even a step further. If we believe we should be angry because we want to be angry with the things God is angry with, are we also just as willing to be compassionate with God's compassion? Do we agree with God's mercy? Do we want to follow with what His Word says for our lives, or do we want to pick and choose? Are we prepared to humble ourselves for the sake of others as Jesus did? Do we remember God's patience and mercy and how He deals with us and our sin? Are we just as prepared to align ourselves with those things as we are with what we believe is His anger? And so on this 4th of July weekend, are you more concerned with people seeing how much you love your country, your political party, your positions, your social issues, or are you more concerned with seeing how much you love your Jesus and demonstrate His mercy, His love, and compassion in everyday life to those who view things differently than you? Which one is it? So that's my closing question to you this morning. Where are you with this? Where am I with this? How might you be inappropriately handling anger? Do you hold grudges and unforgiveness that feed resentment inside? Do you have a loose, fiery mouth that loves to let people know when you're offended or don't like something? Do you have an overreaction problem or an impatience problem with those you love? The world of psychology is finally coming to agree with the Bible on something here. It turns out that giving in to our impulses and letting it all out, always releasing our anger, turns out all that does is make us really good at releasing our anger. You get good at what you practice. That's the challenge. Instead, to practice Jesus' rhythms of self-control, of kindness, of compassion for others that we disagree with, of humility, of gentleness. Practice those. Because whatever we practice, we get better at doing. So why don't we practice those things until they become second nature? And then, just maybe, when we act naturally, according to that newly learned nature, what people will see in us won't be fiery red eyes at a perceived violation or a political stance, but maybe what they'll see is Jesus. 1 Timothy 1, verses 15 and 16. Here is a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. But for that very reason I was shown mercy, so that in me, the worst of sinners, Christ Jesus might display His unlimited patience as an example for those who would believe on Him and receive eternal life. That verse is our message this morning. As we go into communion this morning, can we let that verse be our prayer? That Jesus might display His love, His mercy, His compassion, His goodness, His humility, His gentleness, His unlimited patience through us as an example to those who might believe in Him. We're going to take communion, which is simply a ceremonial time that we celebrate, we remember every week. where Jesus had gathered with his disciples. He gave them bread. He broke it. He gave them juice. So this is my body. This is my blood given up for you. When you gather, do this to remember me. And it's a ceremonial reminder that Jesus is our heartbeat. Jesus assigns our value. And what took place on the cross is our hope and our promise and our anchor. Let's all be reminded of that as we take communion this morning. As the trays are passed, take the bread and eat it. Take the juice and drink it. Put the cup back in and then pass the plate along. If you're here this morning and you're not sure where you stand with that, feel free to just pass it along and use this time for quiet reflection, okay? Let's let this communion time be a time that we spend time with God and talk about this stuff, okay? Because this is real. Let's pray and then we'll take communion.